final day, and it's been really quite exciting and enlightening. I guess our job today is to bring it all home, tie everything neatly together, wrap up everything perfectly. Probably not. That's not the way historians typically work. Chances are we'll get some version of it's more complicated than that, heard several times today. And yet I do hope that in these sessions you can see the different threads in the conference that have been following through each of the days that we've had panels on environmental questions, of which this one will take up, questions about American Indians and Native peoples, a thread that'll be in the next session, and also then very broad issues about the meaning of the West, the code of the West, Westerns, the myth, the history, and those have also played out across, and we'll bring that together in the final session today. So a very exciting morning, and I'm delighted to be joined, and you already know all these people, having heard from them at several panels already, but for those out in C-SPAN land, I'm joined by Dan Flores, Marnie Sandweiss, and Sarah Dant, and they are, as you well know from the bios, eminent historians of the American West, and also in the case of the American environment, in particular in various ways, and American culture. So I think to get us started, to sort of both remind us where we were a little bit in the sessions that we've heard, including yesterday, and also to sort of set the scene a little bit for the end of the 19th century and how changes in American society broadly and in the American West in particular were reshaping American attitudes and views towards nature and the natural world, and the ways in which then that impacted thinking about or the beginnings of conservation, the title of this discussion, as well as some of the legislation that came out of it that continues to have a profound impact on the world and the West we live in today. But let me start, Marnie, with you, and ask you to sort of set the scene a little bit and provide some of the cultural and context that sort of is shaping the era in terms of what's going on in the last decades of the 19th century.
Sure, thank you, Steve. And I think before I talk about the 1890s, I want to talk just a moment about yesterday. When we made our field trip yesterday out to Bill Koch's Bear Ranch, we saw a vision of a particular slice of Western history. We saw a town that was meant to suggest a small rural Western town in the Rockies, or the Great Basin, between the 1860s and the 1880s. And what I want to argue today is that that kind of fascination with that particular moment of Western history is not new. And the 1890s, which is really where our conversation is starting this morning, is where we see that fascination with a particular moment of what seemed to be vanished Western history really take root. So let me just mention quickly a few key people here to keep in mind as we start our conversation today. The first is a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner. Is that a name that's familiar to anyone? In 1893, he published an essay called The Frontier in American Culture. And Turner was a kind of anxious man. He looked at the 1890 census, which said that there was no longer a continuous line of sparsely settled land, i.e. a frontier. And that line, he said, had marked all of previous American history. And at the frontier, he argued, people were stripped of their familiar conventions, forced to confront the environment, and from that interaction emerged a particular vigorous kind of American democracy. And he worried, now that the frontier was technically gone, how would Americans renew that democratic spirit? So he had the sense that a key moment had just passed. But let me throw out a few other figures who are circling around American culture at the same time. The first is Teddy Roosevelt. In 1884, he has a breakdown after the almost simultaneous death of his mother and his wife, and he goes out to Dakota Territory for a rest cure. Because this elite Easterner had the sense that in the West, in the wilderness, he could recover a kind of vitality. And in fact, as you probably know, for the rest of his life, he's a spokesperson for what people called the camp cure, this return to the wilderness to recover one's manly vigor. Yesterday at the ranch, we saw a number of copies of Frederic Remington paintings and a number of Frederic Remington sculptures. Frederick Remington, the great Western artist, and I regret we don't have one of his pictures right behind us right now, is out west in the 1890s, and he too is an Easterner. And he too senses that something really vital has just disappeared. And he wrote this right before his death in 1909. The West is no longer the West of picturesque and stirring events. Romance and adventure have been beaten down in the rush of civilization. The country west of the Mississippi has become hopelessly commercialized, shackled in chains of business to its uttermost limits. The cowboy, the real thing, mark you, disappeared with the advent of the wire fence. And as for the Indian, there are so few of them he doesn't count. So when he's painting these paintings from New Rochelle, New York, he too is regretting a West that seemed to have just disappeared. And we could throw into this mix the Philadelphia novelist Owen Wister, who writes the first great Western, The Virginian, in 1902. That novel evokes so much of what we saw yesterday at the Wild West town. The Virginian has a code of the West. If he gives his word, he keeps it, and he's never rude to women. The Virginian invents the scene of the shootout in the street between the good guy and the bad guy. And you could almost visualize that happening last night at Bear Ranch. So there's an intense anxiety at this particular moment in the 1890s that the West has somehow profoundly changed. And just to wrap up, I think it's no coincidence that this is the moment in 1891 we see the birth of the Sierra Club to help preserve some of that West, or that we see Yosemite, which has been a state park since the 1860s, in 1890 become a national park, or that we see, as you'll hear in a moment, a number of federal acts passed to preserve the wilderness. There's an intense anxiety in the 1890s, and Americans are worrying how to preserve what seemed to have just slipped from their grasp.
Thank you. So let's actually pick up on that and ask both Dan and then Sarah to weigh in on the ways in which this cultural anxiety about the changes in the West and changes in American society more broadly, as increasing numbers of Americans find themselves living in cities and working at industrial occupations, that the Jeffersonian ideal of the yeoman farmer seems to be slipping further and further into the American past, that the frontier spirit that, as Marnie said, and is quoting Frederick Jackson Turner, that had been so crucial to invigorating the American character seem to be also fading into the past. How that translates into actual, not just thinking and anxiety, but also into real concrete action and the beginnings of what we see as an environmental movement and the tensions within that. So actually picking up on the themes, the way you two divided it in the previous panel that you did. And I'm going to make you Mr. Flora. No, fauna, excuse me. Dan, I didn't want to turn you into a florist.
Despite the last name.
Yes, so Mr. Flores, Dr. Flores will be our fauna person, and Dr. Dant will be our flora person. You could have done this neater.
And I wore these
There you go,
shirts.
thank you.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Marnie, for that wonderful kind of contextual explanation of what's going on. So what we historians refer to this period as looking back on the culture of it is the period of the nostalgic West, which is what Remington and Russell often portray in their art, or post-frontier anxiety. And post-frontier anxiety took a lot of forms, but one of the forms it tended to take was a feeling that the civilized 20th century was closing in on people, that suddenly this intoxicating, untrammeled freedom we had had in the 19th century was being curtailed. And one of the ways it's being curtailed is, particularly as Sarah is about to explain for you, is through the beginnings of a conservation movement that attempts to apply that regulatory corrective to the story of the Petri dish that I was offering up as a metaphor for you a couple of days ago. If you remember, I said that ecologists often use this aphorism of putting a food source and bacteria in a petri dish, and without some sort of correction, without another species of bacterium that prevents the original bacteria from simply running wild, what the original bacteria will do is eat everything available and then basically destroy themselves. And if you look at the 19th century West as a kind of a prelude to this period of post-frontier anxiety, what you realize about it is that, and it's part of the reason we're so fascinated with it still today, is that it offered up this kind of opportunity for the untrammeled and intoxicating freedom that we simply wouldn't get again from 1900 or so on. In some ways, that's kind of a demarcation of the end of the frontier as well. I just want to point out to you, though, the rationale for the regulation that came in the early 20th century that we call the conservation movement was built on pretty sound principles. Because if you look at that intoxicating freedom of the 19th century, in terms of the faunal life of the American West, what in effect it produced was the largest single destruction of wildlife that's discoverable in modern history. I mean, we lost some species entirely. The most numerous bird in the entire world, the passenger pigeon, became extinct. The most brightly colored large bird of North America, the Carolina parakeet, became extinct. We nearly lost bison, as I mentioned the other day, down to only 1,000 animals. We nearly lost elk. We drew pronghorns down from 15 million to 13,000. We drew 50,000 grizzly bears down to a few hundred. We don't know exactly how many. I mean, one species after another. Gray wolves, which are extirpated in the lower 48 by the 1920s, we basically lose. 3 million wild horses we send off to dog food plants in Illinois when the DeKalb Company starts making dog food its primary product and basing it on wild horses in the West. So it's this amazing, almost mind-boggling destruction of animals. The other day, I told you I would read you two quotes that were only 26 years apart in the West. And I read you the first one, which was from John James Audubon's trip up the Missouri River in 1843, where he's absolutely gobsmacked by this tremendous abundance of animals. He says, no one can imagine the diversity and the abundance of the wildlife that you could see ascending the Missouri River. 26 years later, someone most of you will be familiar with here in Colorado, the Earl of Dunraven, who of course would buy up Estes Park prior to the creation of Rocky Mountain National Park, and who was one of a whole host, there were at least 7 or 8 elite Europeans who went on safari in the American West in the 19th century. And the Earl of Dunraven, along with Duke Alexei of Russia, were among the last two to do so. And in 1869, the Earl of Dunraven, on a hunt out on the Great Plains east of Denver, northeast of Denver actually, finished up a run through a herd of elk out on the plains, from which he and his partners shot down more than 60 animals. And they shot pronghorns as they were fleeing. They shot at buffalo, although they didn't actually kill a buffalo in this particular hunt. They were surrounded by animals, and it was this wild adventure for about 5 or 6 minutes. That's all it lasted. And then he went to the camp that night and sat down to his journal, and this is what he wrote. And what I think he was conveying to us, the Earl of Dunraven was a sensitive sort of safari hunter who spent a lot of time in Europe with painters and poets and actors. And so he was more sensitive than a lot of these Westerners, I think. He wrote this: in a second, it was all gone. There was not a living creature to be seen. and the oppressive silence was unbroken by the faintest sound. I looked all around the horizon, not one sign of life. Everything then became dull, dead, quiet, unutterably sad and melancholy. What the Earl of Dunraven was conveying to his journal and to the world was really what this untrammeled freedom on the frontier had wrought. We had basically destroyed the world like those bacteria in the Petri dish. And without any kind of regulation, that's the sort of world we were creating. And that's the world we longed for in the 19-teens and the 1920s, looking back on the 1870s and 1880s. Wouldn't it be wonderful to go back? But of course, you can't go back unless you come up with some way of creating a future that provides some sort of curb to the instincts of human nature. What the Earl of Dunraven was experiencing was really what we humans had done for more than 40,000 years, leaving Africa and spreading around the world. We had done this over and over and over again, and this was the last time we got to do it. Now we confronted a world that was going to require some sort of curb on the appetites of human nature. And we call that curb conservation.
Okay, so let me turn from Flores to Floral and sort of pick up the theme in terms of how it gets translated into legislation, policy, new ideas about how to curb that human appetite for killing all in front of it, or for destroying all, or as Terry Anderson said, I think in his session, invoking the idea of the tragedy of the commons as a theme that we might want to also come back to at some point.
Yeah, I'd like to thank my colleagues for that really great setup. And the tragedy of the commons was exactly the idea that I was going to pick up on, because the tragedy of the commons is an idea that an ecologist named Garrett Hardin came up with in the 1960s. And what he said was essentially that, and he used the idea of an English commons, and he said if you have a village surrounded by a grazing commons and all have access to the commons and everyone can put a single cow on the commons, then it is a sustainable system because there's not too much destruction visited upon the commons. And as long as everyone operates in the common good, then it works very well. It's very stable and it's sustainable. But the trouble comes, the tragedy, as he called it, comes when an individual says, if I add just one more cow to the commons, that won't degrade the commons, but it will substantially increase my own wealth and success. And that's true. As long as he's the only one who does that, there's no discernible difference. But when everyone acts in their own interests, everyone puts another cow on, then you get overgrazing and the destruction of the commons. Therein, Hardin said, lies the tragedy. And so in some ways what we're seeing here is the playing out of this idea of the tragedy of the commons by the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We've got water sources that have been radically degraded by overgrazing, extensive timber harvests. We've lost massive numbers of animals, and there's this nostalgia for how do we recapture that? And in the early 20th century, the answer was, and I realize this would not be a logical thought today, the federal government is the solution to the problem. I know, you can laugh. But the federal government is the solution to the problem. These are progressive reformers who believed in the idea of that the federal government was the best steward of the nation's natural resources. And so what we see is the creation of the public lands system, which we're also very fond of here in the West. The sense that we were wanting to protect our watersheds was the genesis for our national forests. Our national forest system doesn't really come out of a desire to protect trees as much as it does to protect water, which we talked about a couple of days ago being really the essential resource that you need to survive and be successful in the West. And the idea that we need national parks, as Marnie suggested, again, these protections were all about creating, in many ways, a federal commons, a way for all of us to have access to the kinds of resources that would make us a truly great nation. And so at the beginning of the 20th century, we had two, well, let's go with the three noun beginning of the 20th century: conservation, preservation, and reclamation. And I'll just briefly talk about what each of those was. They're all coming out of this concern of loss. And the first of these was conservation. This was the idea of Theodore Roosevelt and his chief forester, Gifford Pinchot. And the idea was that we needed to conserve resources for future use. It's a utilitarian idea. The idea is we need to have protected forests so that we always have, as Pinchot liked to say, forests for the home builder first of all, so that we could always create homes and the cities that would make us a thriving economy. At the same time, there's also a different way of valuing nature that is probably most commonly associated with John Muir, and this is the idea of preservation. Preservation valued nature for its aesthetic value. It's not so much about board feet of timber or acre feet of irrigation. It's about the sublime. It's about the beauty of nature and its restorative power. And a lot of times these two ideas could work very closely with one another, and that's we get the protection of places like Yosemite and other of the early national parks. But the utilitarian idea behind conservation was probably the winner of this first round of discussion about the public lands, and nowhere is that more evident than in reclamation. So we talked about last time that in order to succeed in the arid West, which is less than 20 inches of rainfall a year, you're going to have to irrigate in order to successfully farm. And irrigating the arid lands of the West was a cost that was simply not bearable by individuals, by corporations, or even by the states. And believe me, we tried all of those things. So once again, the federal government to the rescue with, in 1902, something called the Newlands Reclamation Act. And the Newlands Reclamation Act created the Bureau of Reclamation within the federal government with the idea that the federal government would build the kind of hydraulic water system that could make the desert bloom. We would build dams, we would build irrigation, we would build canals, and this would be the way to reclaim the West from the desert and make our settlement dreams there a success. And it's one of the reasons I think Molly talked about in our panel the other day. There are actually more homesteads claimed in the 20th century than there were in the 19th century. And it's what makes all of our Western states possible today. It kind of flies in the face of John Wesley Powell, who I mentioned the other day, and it brings water to where the people were. We're going to settle where we want to, and then, by gosh, we're going to just engineer our way to the water. And so in many ways then, what we tried to do was create a federal commons of public lands and resources, whether it was water in the reclamation programs, public lands in our forests and in our national parks. These were going to be the resources that all Americans could have access to that would hopefully restore the promise that the West had been, perhaps, in the 19th century.
So these introductory comments and sort of also bringing forward from the previous panel on the environment, and now with the legislation and sort of new thinking that comes into place, and the dramatic changes that it brings to the way in which 19th century Americans had typically conceived these ideas and issues. I guess I want to ask all of you, in your view, what went right, what went wrong, or what worked reasonably well, and what turned out not to work so well? And then I'll come back to you, Marnie, to ask you sort of in what ways also this change in thinking, how deep it went, How were Americans reassured anew by the, how did they come to terms with a post-frontier world in which these conservation, how does that reflect in the culture? But let me start with Dan and Sarah, just talking about sort of, because we're used to, there was a snicker about the federal government as the solution here. But I guess let's sort of hear what went right before we go to what went wrong also.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, since we're talking about the federal government, and we've snickered, as we commonly do these days, about the federal government, let me just convey to you about that story I've been telling you about the destruction, this planetary wide level destruction of wildlife that we executed in the American West in the 19th century, that our instinct initially in history was to blame that, who else but on the federal government. Mm-hmm. This story of how the federal government participated in the destruction of Western wildlife was first promulgated, and this is a fairly new explanation for this, I should say. It was first promulgated by former buffalo hunters during the conservation period who found themselves really, aspersions were cast at what they had done, that they had killed all these animals, millions of this iconic animal, now the faunal symbol of the United States. And so a particular buffalo hunter named John Cook in 1905 wrote a book, a memoir, called On the Border with the Buffalo, and he came up with this explanation for why they had done it. What he essentially argued in his book was that we were the heroes of the advance of civilization, and not only that, we were actually the agents of the federal government in destroying all this wildlife. Because the federal government wanted these animals destroyed, they engaged in a secret conspiracy between policymakers in Washington and the Western Army to kill all these animals for several reasons, one of which was to force Indians onto reservations, another of which was to open the landscape for homesteading. And so the government had secretly done this, he argued, and he even went so far as to invent a very famous speech. You can go online and buy a t-shirt with lines from this speech on it. It's almost like the George Patton speech you saw George C. Scott deliver in that famous movie about George Patton, where you can almost see the American flag rippling behind, and it's attributed to Philip Sheridan, who supposedly is going to appear before the Texas legislature in the 1870s to prevent the Texas legislature from passing a bill to outlaw buffalo hunting. And it turns out that Philip Sheridan, as I discovered in working on this American Serengeti book, had not only never gone to Austin to testify before the legislature there, the Texas legislature, that had always struck me as suspicious, which is why I looked. The Texas legislature had never considered such a bill. But that explanation that appeared in this memoir by a buffalo hunter became the explanation that historians and journalists used for the next century, really, to explain what had happened to all these animals in the West. What actually happened, of course, is that we just let the market work. The federal government had never passed a law to inhibit any kind of wildlife hunting in the United States, and we didn't do so until 1900. And so, sort of like the South deciding after the Civil War that the Civil War was not caused by slavery, it was a lost cause to preserve states' rights. That made everybody feel better about the Civil War. Blaming the government made everybody feel better for what we actually had done individually through selfish means to all these animals in the 19th century. So what we ended up doing in the early 20th century was having some success by protecting game animals that we wanted to hunt and deciding that predators were the animals we needed to exterminate. and we would substitute human hunters for predators like mountain lions, wolves, and bears. That gave us our 20th century regulations, so we preserved some of these animals. Not buffalo, which we did save, but we didn't allow them to be wild animals in the West in the 20th century. But we did allow elk and some of these other animals to be wild, and we simply came up with this strategy of those are the animals we'll save, we'll kill all the predators as rapidly as we can, and we'll substitute human hunters for the predators, thus producing our 20th century and 21st century strategy of wildlife management.
So I'm aware the time is short here, and I want to make sure we have time for questions. So let me just very quickly on one of your points there, let's talk about water.
Sure.
Because as we all know, or as you mentioned, in 1902, the National Reclamation Act is passed. The federal government becomes then more engaged, becomes the agent, the engineer of this massive hydraulic engine projects that sort of bring water where it's needed in the West. And as we know, then all the water problems in the West are solved, right?
Indeed, yeah. So it's all good, and we're done, and we can go to questions.
Okay, we're open.
So I would say that that's in many ways sort of at the same time one of the great successes and one of the failures of the federal reclamation project. As you all know, living in the West now, the federal government's pursuit of conservation, preservation, and reclamation have made it a dominant presence in the West. You don't live in the West and not be quite aware of the federal government. But you don't turn on the tap or the sprinkler pretty much anywhere in the West without being the beneficiary of federal water management. And certainly that made the desert bloom in many ways, often at the expense of the Eastern folks who ended up funding it. Your taxpayer dollars at work in the West were funded by those farmers who were getting put out of business by Western agriculture. In some ways. But the challenge, of course, as we come into the present with this massive hydraulic scheme that we have in place is how do we continue to sustain it? Because as I was talking yesterday in answer to Ms. Siegel's question about Utah trying to steal water, everybody's trying to steal water. And climate change is water change. And we have become so dependent. We live in places like Phoenix and Las Vegas and Los Angeles at the blessing of really of water management. And now we're going to have to confront the reality that there's just not going to be the kind of water to go around that there has been in the past. And that's going to have some really serious consequences.
So the National Reclamation Act is in part passed, though, with the promise that it's going to restore the Jeffersonian ideal. It's going to turn the American West into a land of yeoman farmers and into a garden. Sarah suggests that's not exactly what happens. And Marnie, I wonder if you could talk about a little bit about how Americans and Westerners in particular, and artists and so forth, adjust to the post-frontier world, and one which is not the Jeffersonian West.
Well, let me try to answer that question by going back to your original final round question about what worked and what didn't. Where do we see successes and where do we see mistakes? And I would say just look no farther than the national parks. You know, as Ken Burns said in his documentary a few years, they are America's best idea. And any of you who have been to Yellowstone Glacier, Yosemite, are going to agree with that. But those national parks were invented and created with the kind of fin de siècle nostalgia that we've been talking about in mind. And the national parks were not empty wilderness areas when they were created. They were areas where Native peoples lived, hunted, fished, worked, etc. But the National Park Service, or the federal government before the Park Service was created after World War I, created those parks and removed Indian peoples. So I think now we go, yes, preserving that land, brilliant idea. But removing the Indian peoples who used it, not such a good idea. And right now, you can Google, you can look around, and you can see that the National Park Service is trying very hard to develop new ways of working with Native peoples as co-managers, as partners, as providers of traditional ecological knowledge that will allow for better park management. So I think that's actually a moment where we see the federal government reckoning very directly with a mistake they made when these parks were invented over a century ago.
Thank you. All right, so let's open it up. We have a few minutes. And I see Terry has a question.
Thanks. I I hesitate to throw water on this wonderful nostalgia tour, but I'm going to. It's easy to look back and the bison is the easiest one to point to, even better than the passenger pigeon, although the passenger pigeon went extinct and bison didn't. But bison, we I guess maybe because we still see them, and point to those as examples of the tragedy of the commons writ large and the destruction that comes. But two things have to be kept in mind through all that. One is that the tragedy that occurred there was a tragedy of a lack of ownership and a lack of ownership of bison and wildlife generally. And human beings have tried to deal with those kinds of problems. The Native Americans understood how to control the tragedy of the commons through kinds of property institutions, if you will, salmon streams in the Pacific Northwest that were owned by clans and families, clam gardens in the Pacific Northwest that were cultivated. These were examples where human ingenuity really allowed people to overcome the tragedy. So we're not like a petri dish. Now, yes, we did destroy much of the bison population because we didn't come up with those other alternatives. An ownership alternative. Yes, Ted Turner fences in a lot of bison on his ranches, but that's not what we think of as wildlife. The other point I think that's important to make, though, is that, yeah, we lost some buffalo and we lost this nostalgic view, but we got something else. We are rich people today in part because we cultivated the land. We are rich people today because we can produce a lot of food in the West, largely, in many cases at least, due to, Sarah said, beneficiaries of federal water management. I wrote that down, scratched out management, and put subsidies. Yes, it's federal government subsidies that allow a lot of this. But even had those not come about, we were irrigating parts of the West. We would have, I think, done it more sensibly without the reclamation project myself, but that's another story. The bottom line here is just, I think we ought to be careful of not coming into this nostalgic view without recognizing we got some other things that were pretty darn good. And finally, just one quick point. With regard to national parks, you ask people, who created Yellowstone? And almost everybody says, oh, it was Teddy Roosevelt. He was 14 years old when we created Yellowstone. Who created the national parks, Yellowstone especially? The railroads. And they did it totally for profit reasons. They wanted to control it. The Northern Pacific controlled Yellowstone, and all the major parks have that.
Okay, so quickly, because there are a lot of questions, and I realized that was a hard one to answer quickly, but.
Yeah, a lot of points. From Terry, who has headed up an organization in Bozeman, Montana to develop free enterprise solutions to environmental problems. So well said. Yeah, so I would say this, Terry. Very good point about Native peoples going for 10,000 years, at least 8,000 years, and not eating up the contents of the Petri dish in the American West. They did that in the aftermath, however, of an extraordinary collapse that was even larger than the one we confronted in the 19th century, which we call the Pleistocene extinctions, which, whether you concede that Native people participated, and they probably did for at least a species or two, they did witness it. And so it's something like the way the Pueblo Indians in the Southwest responded to the Chaco and collapse in the 12th and 13th centuries. They came up with whole new strategies after suffering this tremendous disaster that were far more regulatory, far more careful, and in some respects, in the case of, because I've studied bison a lot, and I've studied that 8,000-year interaction between Native people and bison. I mean, one of the arguments about this that ecologists make that I tend to believe is that bison actually were better adapted to life on the Great Plains than Native people were. And that's one of the reasons bison survived after the Pleistocene extinctions. But I think that it's the recognition of how the world has to be reshaped after you suffer a disaster. And I think that's what Native people did, and I think that's what conservation really amounted to at the end of the 19th century. We recognized we had to reshape the way we were using the world, and we had to come up with some sort of regulatory mechanisms. And so I see a commonality between those two things that you pointed out, not a dissonance.
I don't think you'll ever be at another conference again where the Pleistocene extinctions and the conservation policies of the 20th century have ever been linked together. So, well, do you want to add anything, Sarah?
Well, I would just say this. One of the questions I like to ask in my book, in class, and just with people in general is, at what cost? At what cost do we make the choices that we do? And I don't ask that as an economic question. I ask that as a human question. And you're right, there are economic benefits derived from the slaughter of all these animals. For a very small group of people, and for a very significant group of people, Native people in particular, that's an economic devastation that comes in. Free market environmentalism, and I know you're a major advocate of it, and I think there's some really good ideas that come out of it, but sometimes it fails to consider the human cost of things in favor of an economic concern. And that's my frustration with the loss of animals, with open lands, things like that, is that we don't just want to talk about how that comes out on an accounting ledger. We need to talk about what that means to people and their lives, because really, you know, especially for those of us living now, we count as part of the calculus of our good life. We value access to public lands, open spaces, clean air, clean water, and being able to see really spectacular animals. Everybody, I think, took a selfie with the bison when you came in, didn't you? And yet it's a stuffed one. I don't want a stuffed one, I want a real one. And I want to be able to see him.
Okay, so what I want to do very quickly here, because I see lots of hands and very limited time. So what I ask the people and ask very quick questions, and we'll do it as a lightning round. So wait for the microphone. Very quick questions. Don't answer them. Just sort of keep them in mind, and we'll do them as a set answer at the end. So quickly.
I heard the number of 30 million bison. How come they didn't cause overgrazing? Was there enough grass for 30 million bison?
Don't answer that. Yeah. Go there.
Hard to make this quick. Do you see the country as like a kid who's running amok? We're a very young country, and the addiction to the killing and a kid running amok versus growing up and then being quite adolescent. Do you see it in developmental terms and growing up, and how are we going to grow up with responsibility and thinking of others? No.
Okay, all right. Marnie, you're going to do the bison. You take
Wait,
that one. Don't
yeah,
answer that,
Molly
and we'll
has
get
one
one more over
question.
there from Molly.
Sarah, I think, is the one who, just as an aside, talking about the creation of the public land system, said this is something we're very fond of. So I would like you to talk about the Bundys, for instance, and the whole sovereign citizen movement, which is now saying that public land system is terrible and we should all return it to the people who live there.
Okay, so we're going to start with bison, children and developing. Congratulations.
And Bundy.
And then Bundy.
Great.
Okay.
The reason we think there were between 20 and 30 million bison on the original Great Plains now, rather than 60 million, which you've often heard, and you'll still see that figure trotted out, is because the 20 to 30 million is based on the carrying capacity of the grasslands. And that fluctuation between 20 and 30 million is also based on the fact that the climate was constantly changing. It was, for example, there was something called the Little Ice Age, which produced a lot of rain and a lot of grass and grew the bison populations large. Then starting in the middle of the 19th century, there was about a 12-year drought in the West that reduced the carrying capacity down to about 20 million animals, just at about the time the market started taking them out and killing them. So it's kind of a natural equilibrium that's created between grass, climate, and animals.
Okay, children.
Okay. That's a good question, and I would just simply say that America is not like a parent taking care of a child or a few children. We are a democracy, and we are an evolving democracy, and we are an imperfect democracy. And I think we see right now, as we see evolving debates about the EPA and about climate change and our current political climate, that the government still comes from the people. The government reflects the idea of its multiple constituencies. So I don't think this is quite the top-down model that your interesting analogy suggests. I think it's a two-way street.
And the Bundys.
So the Bundy occupation of the Malheur Bird Refuge and refusal to pay grazing fees in southern Utah is a modern manifestation of the Sagebrush Rebellion, which first appeared in the 1970s. It's basically a states' rights, take back the land movement. And my argument about that has always been that is a very ahistorical understanding of our creation, particularly in the West. Unless you're one of the original 13 states, you did not own the land first, and then the federal government took it. The federal government bought the West, acquired the West, and then created the states. And those federal lands have been federal lands. They aren't ones that somehow got robbed from the people. They've always been federal lands. And quite frankly, they were the lands that in many cases nobody wanted, like Nevada. No offense.
Ooh. Okay, do we have any Nevadans out here? Would you like a follow-up? Do we have time for one more quick lightning round, or?
Maybe one more.
Okay. Any other questions?
No?
Okay, let me give you all a chance for one final remark then, to sum it all up, to tie it all together, to send everyone home happy.
I think we're still trying to figure out how to live properly in the world. It's taken us a long time. We've been on this planet as a species for more than 200,000 years, Homo sapiens I'm talking about. We've been trying to figure it out ever since we've been here, and we're still struggling to do it. As we look at the future, that's how I think we have to confront the future, that we've been trying to figure out how to make this planet work for us for a long time, and we haven't quite gotten it right yet, but we're closer.
Can't disagree with a word of that, Dan. And I think I would also add that as we walk outside for lunch and look at the surrounding environment and drive to wherever we're going this afternoon, I think we have to agree that for all the mistakes the federal government has made, we are very fortunate people to live with the benefits it's conferred upon us in terms of Western land and Western resources.
So it's always good to end with a quote, and sometimes there's no one better to quote than Wallace Stegner. And what Wallace Stegner said was, "It is hard to be pessimistic about the West. It is the native home of hope."
How about that? Thank you.